Shaman Village is easily one of the most captivating areas added in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. It's where Marika the Eternal was born, and would later become a tragic memorial site for her people's persecution by the hornsent. But what none of us could have guessed is that Shaman Village would lead to some strange revelations about an area we've all been to in the base game. And these ties might help us to figure out the identity of one of Elden Ring's most elusive characters, the Gloam-Eyed Queen. I welcome you, Tarnished, to join me, Zayf the Scholar, as I try to tie together some strange new evidence from the DLC that closely ties Queen Marika the Eternal to the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Let's talk about it. Zayf the Scholar here, and today we're revisiting the focus of the first YouTube video I ever made, and for my money, one of the creepiest locations in all of Elden Ring, Dominula Windmill Village. Out of all the interesting and lore-centric locations we have in the base game, I'm willing to bet nearly no one predicted the DLC would give us some additional lore about Dominula of all places. And yet here we are, found in the Altus Plateau not far from Leyndell. From a distance, Dominula looks almost idyllic. A small hill-and village covered in beautiful pink and purple flowers and windmills. It almost looks like a pastoral painting. Until you take a closer look. Because when you do, you'll find that Dominula is the site of a strange all-female cult that is partaking in a ritual that involves skinning their victims. Or as we learn from a stranded spirit in the village, I hear a festive melody. No, don't skin me. My hide is filthy, I swear. And things only get creepier from here. The village inhabitants, for example, referred to as celebrants, have a very strange zombie-like appearance, are wearing blood-soaked clothing, and are either engaged in enraptured laughter and dancing, or creepily rubbing their face on things. And it gets even stranger, because at the top of the village, for some reason we find a godskin apostle. Now, as you may already know, the Gloam-Eyed Queen isn't a character we're ever directly shown in Elden Ring. But the godskins who we encounter at numerous points throughout our journey have deep ties to her, from which we can glean lots of useful information. Perhaps most significant is the godskin incantation Black Flame ritual, which tells us that the Gloam-Eyed Queen led the apostles and was an Empyrean chosen by the Fingers. Out of all of Elden Ring's text, there are only 4 characters referred to as Empyreans: Lunar Princess Ranni, the twins Miquella the Unalloyed and Malenia the Severed, and finally Queen Marika herself. So the Gloam-Eyed Queen being labeled an Empyrean automatically makes her a character of great significance. And this is only amplified when you learn that she possessed a black flame capable of slaying gods. A flame that she would share with the godskin apostles, who channeled its power through her Godslayer's greatsword. But we also learn from in-game sources that the Gloam-Eyed Queen was more than just a god-killer. The godskin swaddling cloth, for example, paints a picture of the Gloam-Eyed Queen as a maternal figure, who cradled newborn apostles who would soon grow to become the death of the gods. The incantation Black Flame's protection, meanwhile, further paints a picture of her as a motherly protector, stating that the apostles were all embraced by the Gloam-Eyed Queen, and the Black Flame was their armor within. And so, on top of being an Empyrean, who also possessed the power to kill gods, she was lovingly raising a following who could wield this power as well, until she was defeated by Marika's shadowbound beast, Maliketh. Now, importantly, we aren't told why Maliketh defeated the Gloam-Eyed Queen, nor are we told what happened to her in the aftermath. Both the English and the Japanese text leave her fate vague by saying she was simply defeated rather than killed. It does seem safe to say, though, that Maliketh was likely acting on orders from Marika, thus forming an important link between these two queens. And in Dominula, we find evidence to further suggest connections between Marika and the Gloam-Eyed Queen. For one thing, the flower-adorned crosses throughout the village are in the shape of Marika's seal, quite similar to the stakes of Marika we see throughout the game, as well as the same mark present on Marika's rune and sword seal. Looking more closely, we can also see that many of the celebrants wear yellow capes bearing symbols of the Erd Tree. But puzzlingly, as pointed out by Reddit user Here's the Wolfman, other villagers wear blue capes that have the same symbols as those found on the seven-faced aprons of the Godskin nobles. The blue festive garb description reads, "Use of this garb, dyed in a stunning blue, is only permitted for the young maids who play a central role in the festival." And again, this is a festival that seems to revolve around skinning people and a Godskin noble who lives at the top of the village. So, why would these villagers celebrate both Marika, a figure who symbolizes life and light, and her diametric opposite, the Gloam-Eyed Queen who symbolizes death and darkness? And if that wasn't perplexing enough, thanks to some revelations in the DLC, Dominula becomes even more interesting. Because we can draw multiple parallels between Dominula and Shaman Village. To get the most obvious connection out of the way, both villages are covered in beautiful, colorful flowers, which suggests they held some sort of cultural significance to their inhabitants. This may not seem like the strongest connection, but to my knowledge, the hinterland and Dominula are the only places with such a strong floral theme, and they both immediately stand out when you visit them for that reason. Next is the fact that Shaman Village seems to have likely been a matriarchal and potentially all-female society. The grandmother we find at the top of the village and Marika are both female, as are all of the shaman we find within jars throughout the DLC. It's also perhaps worth mentioning that in the Japanese version of the game, shaman are referred to as Miko, which is a designation typically reserved for female shrine maidens or priestesses. Although it is worth mentioning that Miyazaki did deliberately use non-standard kanji for this word that makes the gender more ambiguous. So take that with a grain of salt. Now, aside from the Godskin at the village summit, all of Dominula's celebrants are also female. And things get even more interesting when we observe their hairstyles, which have newly found significance thanks to revelations in the DLC. We of course end up learning that Marika's iconic single-braided look was actually the result of her cutting one of her golden braids and leaving it as a tribute to the grandmother of Shaman Village. Is it purely coincidental that the villagers in Dominula also braid their hair so that, like Marika, they have one braid on their right side? They do also have a long braid in the back, so it doesn't seem to be a perfect match to Marika, but in any case, along with the flowers, the practice of hair braiding is another cultural tie to Shaman Village. And the grandmother of Shaman Village is also depicted with braids. So in sum, the evidence seems to suggest that the Dominula villagers have some ties to the shaman, and that for some reason they partake in a festival that celebrates symbols of both Marika and the Gloam-Eyed Queen. But why would Marika allow by what all accounts should be a blasphemous festival to be celebrated so near to Leyndell and the Erd Tree? Well, a new item from the DLC provides us with some insight here. The description of the festive grease states, "Solidified knot grease made from a mixture of bone shards, coats armament imparting a festive incantation that grants the wielder a scant few runes on landing attacks. The delightful festival is an old tradition, one old enough for the Erd Tree to tacitly tolerate its endurance." So first off, how can we even know that this grease refers to the festival in Dominula? Well, for one thing, in both the English and Japanese texts, the word festive or shukusai is used, and this word only appears otherwise in descriptions relating to the items found in Dominula. Next is the fact that the effect of granting the wielder runes upon landing attacks is the same as the effects of the weapons wielded by Dominula's celebrants. And finally, the illustration of the grease itself also shows that it is covered in flowers like those found in Dominula. I therefore think it's a pretty safe bet to assume that the festive grease is referring to Dominula's festival. And if we accept its description at face value, this celebratory festival of both Marika and the Gloam-Eyed Queen is something that Marika allowed to happen in her backyard because of how ancient a tradition it was. But is that really all? I mean, Marika isn't exactly known for her tolerance of ancient traditions and letting blasphemous symbols stay out in the open. She did hide both Mesmer and the entire ancient hornsent civilization under a giant veil, after all. And I think the evidence that I've shown so far makes it safe to assume that the Gloam-Eyed Queen, Marika, and the Shaman are all somehow connected. So I'm going to throw out what I see as the two likeliest possibilities here. Either the Gloam-Eyed Queen was an Empyrean from Shaman Village who had a rivalry with Marika during her ascension, or the Gloam-Eyed Queen was, in fact, once part of Marika that was cast out. But is there actually any evidence that suggests Marika and the Gloam-Eyed Queen were once one? The most compelling evidence in my mind is the existence of Malenia and Mesmer. We learn in the DLC that Mesmer was born cursed by dark flames and an abyssal serpent, and we also know that the Gloam-Eyed Queen and the Godskin are tied to flames and serpents. Godskin nobles, for example, have snake-like tails, and according to their set, nobles are the most ancient apostles who are said to have assimilated inhuman physiology, not unlike the Crucible, the Erd Tree in its primordial form. And I'll also mention here that many people have observed that Mesmer's lanky physique is quite reminiscent of the Godskin apostles. It's also strongly suggested in the DLC that Malenia is likely Mesmer's younger sister, and we know from the base game that she is also tied to fire and the Gloam-Eyed Queen, or at the very least to destined death.
Lord of frenzied flame. I will seek you as far as you may travel. To deliver you what is yours. Destined death.
On top of that, there's also some evidence that actually ties Malenia to Dominula specifically. The flightless bird painting is said to depict the landscape scene during the last moments of those welcomed into death's embrace. The soul of the painter and vestiges of the dead's last moments can be discovered by visiting the location depicted even now. If we go to the scene depicted in the painting, we find ourselves back in Dominula Windmill Village, where we find the incantation Fire's Deadly Sin. Its description states, incantation originating from a deeply ominous prophecy. Sets both the caster and the surrounding area ablaze with raging flames. The caster's body will remain engulfed in flame for a while, burning them and any who draw near. The prophet despaired, looking up at the Erd Tree, for soon the kindling would burst into flame, bringing ruin. The burning of the Erd Tree is the first cardinal sin. That is not the domain of mere men. Considering that, like Mesmer, Malenia is said to have bore visions of fire, and that Malenia describes herself as burned and bodiless, it seems fair to assume that this spell found in Dominula refers to her. And so now Dominula isn't linked only to the Gloam-Eyed Queen, Marika, and Shaman Village, but also to Malenia and by extension to Mesmer. Now, it doesn't seem to make sense for timeline reasons that Malenia herself is the Gloam-Eyed Queen, nor would that explain Mesmer's afflictions. And I also feel like the motherly descriptions of the Gloam-Eyed Queen don't match up particularly well with Malenia. But could the Gloam-Eyed Queen instead have at one point been an aspect of Mother Marika that she had to cast out in order to create the Golden Order? It certainly wouldn't be the only instance we know of Marika separating a part of herself. And we know from looking at the Jarred Shaman that the hornsent's ritual involved blending many entities together, not just two. I can't help but wonder if before the birth of gold, if Marika was instead claiming to stand for the Crucible, wielding a spiral greatsword, not unlike the iconography we find around Ener Ilim, and backed by an army of apostles who blended with serpents. Even Marika's bracelets seem to have a snake-like motif. As worshippers of the Crucible, it would make sense that the hornsent would back such an Empyrean's ascension to godhood. However, as we learn from the story trailer, the Grace of Gold was born from a seduction and a betrayal. So were the hornsent therefore seduced by the idea of a Crucible-adhering Gloam-Eyed Queen, only to be betrayed? Could this scene of Marika reaching into this godskin-like white flesh and pulling out gold actually be depicting the moment the Gloam-Eyed Queen was cast out? My friend Tim Diggity makes a very similar claim in this video in the card, and points out many more interesting connections between the Gloam-Eyed Queen and serpents, so I highly recommend you go and check that out if you haven't. In any case, I think Marika allowing a festival celebrating the Gloam-Eyed Queen to happen so near to Leyndell is very telling. At the very least, I think it suggests that Marika and the Gloam-Eyed Queen were both from Shaman Village. But maybe it goes deeper than that. Maybe what's happening at Dominula isn't just an ancient festival that involves skinning, but one that celebrates Marika shedding her serpent skin and getting revenge against the hornsent before passing through their holy gate. And while we're on the subject of shedding skin, many have pointed out that in Bonny Village, one of the areas where the shaman were rounded up and persecuted, we can find a giant shed snakeskin next to a statue of Marika, where we receive the O Mother gesture. Could this perhaps be a remnant of when the Gloam-Eyed Queen and Marika were still one? I'd also like to mention that, as pointed out by Reddit user Lord Geiseric, the pose of Marika's statue in the base game invokes the shape of Marika's rune, while the pose of the statues throughout the Land of Shadow seem to invoke the shape of the Rune of Death. I wonder if this could be because the statues in the Land of Shadow were made before Marika was separated from the Gloam-Eyed Queen. But what do you guys think? Is this all too much of a reach? Can you think of any other reasons why Marika would allow Dominula's festival and what seems to be an open embrace of the Gloam-Eyed Queen to happen so close to her home in the capital? Why do the villagers of Dominula, who seem tied to the shaman, celebrate the Gloam-Eyed Queen to begin with? Was the Gloam-Eyed Queen once part of Marika? Or perhaps just another shaman that Marika betrayed? If she wasn't part of Marika, are Mesmer and Melena's serpent and fire afflictions purely coincidental? I definitely don't think I came up with a perfect theory by any means, but I do at least hope that I brought together some interesting connections for you all to think about, and maybe do some cooking of your own. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. It really helps out my channel a lot, and I genuinely appreciate it. And hey, I'd also appreciate it if you considered supporting my work by becoming a patron, a YouTube member, or buying me a coffee. Thanks a ton for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.